What do an 1800s clothes worker and a modern day fashion freelance designer have in common? Well, probably a lot more than you think, and that's what we are going to talk about today. I recently read this book, Blood in the Machine by Brian Merchant, and that's something a bit unusual for me because I don't tend to read non-fiction books. I think that if a book doesn't have any dragons in it, that's a red flag. Actually, that's not true. I do read books without dragons in them. Some of them have spaceships. But anyway, this book is about the Luddite uprisings that happened in England during the 1800s, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it and how it relates to the historical moment that we are living in, and especially to the situation of people like me who work in the fashion industry. If you have no idea about who the Luddites were, or if you think that there were a bunch of crazy people that went around smashing machines, then you do have to read this book. I think it does an amazing job explaining that the whole situation was a bit more complex than that. Blood in the Machine is a book that follows some of the leaders of these Luddite uprisings, as well as some other important personalities of the time, like, for example, the poet Lord Byron and the writer Mary Shelley, the one that wrote Frankenstein, an excellent book despite the absence of dragons. But it also makes a lot of parallels between what was happening then with the introduction of new machinery in the clothing industry and what's happening now with the introduction of other new technologies like AI that are disrupting the way that we work and ultimately our society as a whole. So why are the Luddites and this book relevant to the fashion industry today? Well, first, because what happened in the Luddite times in the 1800s was what made possible the fashion industry that we have today. The Industrial Revolution, that to some extent started with the introduction of new machinery in the clothing industry that made the process of weaving and knitting much faster, allowed for fabrics to be produced at a much higher volume with a lower cost, because now it was possible to manufacture clothes in bulk in factories, again with a much lower cost, though also with lower quality. So the fashion industry, and from that the fast fashion industry, was born. And another way in which we can establish a link between the Luddites and our times were the shifts that were happening in the working conditions. The factory owners were bringing machines to replace the skilled cloth workers by unskilled labor that were paid much less. For example, they used to employ children without even paying them. And the factory owners also used this new technology as a way of pressuring the workers to accept these worse working conditions because there was a high number of unskilled labor available. So if you didn't want to accept those conditions, they have plenty of other people to hire. So the Luddites were groups of cloth workers that didn't accept this situation and decided to pressure the factory owners in turn by breaking their machinery. What is important to understand is that these Luddites didn't rise against the machines because they were new technology, but because they were against the use that they were being given. They were against these machines because they would degrade their working conditions and they would harm their ability to make a living. So in reality, it wasn't a fight against technology, it was a fight in defense of the rights of the workers. And now, if we look at our current situation, we also live in a time where the labor market is very competitive, the companies are always looking to pay lower wages, and then we have the eruption of AI technologies that promises to eliminate a lot of the jobs that we have today, and it's a technology that is pretty much unregulated at this point. Now, like then, we seem on the verge of a change of paradigm, and that change seems inevitable because AI is the future, right? AI is progress, and you cannot be against progress. And we love to see how we have progressed today. today, because look at the Luddites and how they were against these machines, but those machines were the ones that brought the Industrial Revolution, and with that the capitalist society, and ultimately our nice and cozy lives. So what if along the way some sad 18th century workers were out of a job and starved to death? In the end, look how far we have come. Now also look at one of the hundreds of factory workers that we have today in China or Vietnam or India or Bangladesh. Those workers that are paid in a year less than what you spend in a month buying rubbish from Shein, and ask them to compare their working conditions today to those of a factory worker in the 19th century. Ask them if we have really progressed that much and see how they answer. So as we said, we seem to be at a pivotal point like the Luddites, but in our case, the technology that is threatening to make our jobs disappear is AI, and in particular generative AI. I find it very curious that in the fashion industry, I think is one of the few industries that has wholeheartedly embraced the idea of AI, because in other industries there have been protests, there have been people who were fighting against AI, people who raised ethical questions and ethical concerns because generative AI has been trained in stolen content, essentially in copyrighted images, and there are actually some lawsuits against OpenAI and other AI companies about this topic. But in our industry, I think we are so used of companies copying each other to big corporations ripping off smaller designers that we don't even bat an eyelid when a technology comes and does the same thing but on a massive scale. And in fashion, we have this blind belief that things have always to be faster and faster, and that you have to adopt any new technology because you don't want to become obsolete. You have always to be on the latest trend. So we have accepted generative AI without any questions. And as a result, there are already some companies that are using generative AI for the thing that it's designed to do, to substitute human skills with an algorithmic knockoff. For example, there is Levi's using generative AI models to promote diversity, somehow making us believe that that's better than hiring an actual diverse model and paying her the salary that she deserves. And there's also Mango, who did a whole campaign generated by AI, and I actually made a video about that, with the goal of seeing if they could save some money by hiring a couple of prompters instead of a whole team of skilled photographers, models, makeup artists, etc. And there are also softwares like Newark AI, which I also made a video about, that sell you on the idea that you can design something even if you have no design skills, and you can get a realistic representation of it, as if that was going to be helpful at all when a real designer comes and tells you that that garment cannot be produced in real life. So yes, AI is being used to replace workers in the fashion industry, but the important thing to remember is that AI itself is not doing the replacing. The ones that are coming for your jobs are the companies that are using it. And this is a concept that is mentioned in the book several times, because contrary to popular belief, and in quoting from the book, the machine breakers were not ultimately after the machines themselves, but rather the men who were using them to transform social relations and gain power. They clarified the source of the exploitation, not the machine themselves, but the factory owning class. And that is something that we have to be aware of. The immediate threat of AI is not the complete disappearance of the jobs, but the fact that the companies are using this technology to transform the current jobs into something that doesn't require any special skill, and thus can be done with less skilled labor that accepts a lower pay. If we think about an AI-generated campaign like the one that Mango did, In that case, you don't have to pay a photographer that can set their rates high because of their years of experience, their skills, and their own unique style, their own unique way of doing its job. You can pay half of that and get an AI expert whose work is exactly the same as the hundreds of other AI experts out there. So if they ask for a better salary or better working conditions, you can just fire them and hire another because their work is identical. They don't have any real skill, it's the algorithm that does the work. Technology, now and in the Luddite times, has been used by companies as an excuse to lower wages and worsen the working conditions. In the case of generative AI, it is a parasitic technology that cannot survive without the humans that it aims to replace because it nurtures itself in human-created content. It can never eliminate human work completely, but it can be used to exploit the workers more and more. So using generative AI ourselves is being complicit of that exploitation and paves the way for the corporations to continue this abuse. So if we go back to the question at the beginning of the video, what do we have in common with the Luddites? We've seen that we both live in a time of technological advances that can disrupt the way that we work, reduce the number of jobs, and worsen the working conditions. The Luddite solution to that problem was to smash machines, but in the end they failed. Even though I do believe that we can learn a lot from that. First, they took a while to fail, and it took laws that installed death penalty for machine breaking and a lot of policy changes that benefited the machine owners. Policies and regulations did make a change, and in case of the Luddites, it was a change against them, but that's precisely why we have to fight for regulations that protect our interests as workers and not the ones of the corporations. And second, the Luddites knew that the advance of technology is not an unstoppable phenomenon that we have to watch passively from the sidelines. That belief that automation is inevitable, it's what makes it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead, we, the people who are affected by that technology, should have a say about how it is developed and how it is deployed into society. That's what the Luddites were fighting for, and that's what we should be fighting for too. And one of the favorite words of these AI companies is democratize. They are saying that they are democratizing art and democratizing music and democratizing every human skill. But they are not really democratizing anything because you don't magically learn to paint by using Midjourney. You're just outsourcing that work. You're not creating anything yourself. What would really be democratic is letting people decide whether or not they want to use this technology and under which conditions. Because again, we have to forget that false idea that progress should equal economic growth. The economic growth of the few usually at the expense of the many. Because progress instead should be tied to the well-being of a society as a whole. So what can we do if we cannot go around breaking machines? I think we can remember our own agency. I think we can remember that as individuals and also as a collective workforce, we always have a choice. When faced with a technology that can disrupt our lives, as unstoppable as it may seem, we have an easy answer. That is actually one of my favorite quotes from the book. Saying no is and has always been an option. So thank you for being with me through all this reflection about the book. I just wanted to share with anyone really because I am very passionate about this kind of topics, about AI, and I have also a couple of other videos that you can watch about that. So I hope this has been interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and see you soon in the next video.